Some fermentation tips and aeration of the wash. Moonshine Life Recipes Group. Fermentation. Fermentation is the biochemical process that converts sugar to alcohol and carbon dioxide through the action of yeast enzymes called zymase. Yeast metabolizes both aerobically, in the presence of oxygen, and anaerobically, in the absence of oxygen. In the early stages of fermentation, when yeast is added to the sugary wort, it is rapidly multiplying by using sugar to form new cell material. Aerobic stage. After all the dissolved oxygen in the mash has been consumed, the yeast stops multiplying and enters the anaerobic stage, converting the sugar in the mash to alcohol and carbon dioxide. Yeast needs nutrients such as amino acids and nitrogen to be healthy and multiply rapidly. If you attempt to ferment plain sugar dissolved in water, you will need to add large amounts of yeast to compensate for the lack of nutrients in the wash. The yeast simply won't need to multiply as much if there are already sufficient yeast cells present to ferment the available sugars. However, under these conditions, with no added yeast nutrients, you will rarely end up with a wash of more than about 8% ABV before the yeast dies off and stops fermenting. Aeration of the wash. Grain mash is loaded with both nutrients and fermentable sugars. It does benefit from the addition of dissolved oxygen during the early aerobic phase of fermentation, though. For small batches, simply pouring the mash back and forth vigorously between two clean fermentation buckets 4 to 6 times will adequately oxygenate the mash. Unlike the process of making beer or wine, where the mash typically undergoes both a primary and secondary fermentation, a mash to be distilled goes through only primary fermentation. In fact, grain mashes usually ferment no more than 72 to 80 hours before they are distilled. A secondary fermentation would actually adversely affect the ester profile of the mash, resulting in unpleasant tasting liquor. Once the fermentable sugars have been used up, the yeast metabolism changes and begins breaking down and consuming non-fermentable sugars and other organic compounds. This process involves enzymes like permes that lead to the formation of undesirable flavors. This can be avoided, however, by using glucoamylase enzymes to ensure a minimum of non-fermentable sugars. As fermentation progresses, the wash acidifies, eventually lowering the pH to about 3.5. This helps control the growth of unwanted bacteria, which can't survive this kind of acidic environment. If your recipe calls for added bacteria such as lactobacillus, add it to the wash when you add the yeast. Try this. Add lactobacillus bacteria first, then wait to add the yeast. The bacteria will lower the pH of the wash. This will prevent the yeast from forming some of the acids it normally makes, which in turn will noticeably affect the acid and ester profile of the whiskey. I suggest checking the pH of the wash frequently before pitching your yeast, though, and don't wait too long to add the yeast. Start with a delay of 4 to 6 hours after adding the bacteria and experiment from there. Generally, the wash should be distilled as soon as vigorous fermentation stops or slows down to occasional bubbling. Plan to begin distillation once the specific gravity of the wash has dropped to 1.015 or below. Enjoy Moonshine Life Recipes Group.